This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 71. Our first questioner from India asks, what is the Flynn effect for intelligence? Does it actually work? What are the factors behind it?
Flynn effect. Flynn effect is fascinating. It initially offers us incredibly encouraging news about the state of the universe that ultimately winds up being deflating. Flynn effect as follows. Over the course of the last century or so, average IQ scores in every country looked at, developed world, developing world, Antarctica, etc., over the decades of the last century, IQ scores have been gradually rising. So immediately you should be saying, wait, that doesn't make any sense since everybody knows like an IQ score averages out to 100. That's within each generation, each cohort's IQ performance. The average is set to 100. It's standardized to 100 with a standard deviation, which seems redundant. So it is made standardized within. However, before it's being standardized, there are raw scores. And what the Flynn effect is that over the decades, raw scores on IQ tests have been increasing. First point about it is this is not a small effect. Over the last century, IQ tests were first introduced in 1904. In France, it was in English by about 1910, just in time the first mass testing to see which young boys were smart enough to be sent to be slaughtered in the trenches of Europe in World War I. But over the century, average IQ scores, raw scores, have risen 30 points. What does that mean? You take an average person from 1910 and give them a contemporary IQ test, and they would average out to a score of 70. And you take someone now and give them the test from back when, and they would average out to about 130. These are very, very large effects. Okay, so right off the bat, you should be ready to get into an inevitable fist fight over the fact that an IQ test score is not synonymous with intelligence. And thousands of people have fought over that one. We are going nowhere near that one with a 10-foot pole. We're only talking about IQ tests here. Whatever they tell you, whatever they don't tell you, simply scores have been rising over this whole time. So immediately another question should come to mind, which is, wait a second, are they using the same IQ test today that they were using in 1910? Have they changed them over these years? Yeah, there's been a number of iterations. So you can't compare them because there's been different tests. Each time a new test is introduced, a whole bunch of volunteers take the old test and the new test, and that gives you a correction factor for how to know. Take the previous test score, multiply by 0.92 or so, and you have what the current score would be. You have a way to look at the entire spread over the course of history. So this has been increasing. Flynn, where's that coming from? James Flynn, an American political scientist, who fled the United States late 1950s because he was being academically blackballed in the McCarthy era and spent the rest of his life as an academician in New Zealand. James Flynn was the first to see this effect. And immediately you now, of course, are asking, what's the basis of this? Why have average raw IQ scores been increasing over the decades in essentially every country looked at? Well, one thing you could know right off the bat is what does not explain it, which is genetics. Genes don't change that fast. Genes do not change in the same way to this dramatic extent in every population looked at over the course of a century. Genes have squat to do with it. What most people think is the leading explanation for the Flynn effect is education. Education taking two different forms. Education, 1910, I don't know what the number is, but the average American, I think, was not finishing high school, had a very limited number of years of education, and that is dramatically different now with each passing decade. Average number of years of schooling has increased, and that's got to help. And in addition, the nature of the education has been changing over the years. 1910, education was about memorization for the most part. And in the more enlightened corners of education in the last half century, the emphasis has been on abstraction, generalization, extrapolation, more sort of conceptual stuff that goes into teaching rather than just rote memorization. And that pays off. Not only do people get more education, but they get an education that does better training in abstract thinking. Now, Flynn gives this really great TED talk where he gives an example of an intelligence test that was given around 1910 to some rural farmer. And they were asked, okay, what does a fish and a crow have in common? And their answer was nothing, nothing whatsoever. Nothing, nothing at all. They have nothing in common. No, of course not. A fish you can eat, but you can't eat a crow. A crow can peck you, but a fish can't do that. They're completely different. Well, is it possible they're actually similar in that they're both animals? No, no, no. They're completely different. Fish are fish and crows are birds. In other words, very strict, narrow categorical boundaries, heavily influenced by what's the usefulness? Fish you can eat, crows you can't. This was a typical picture then. And Flynn estimates that around 1910 or so, only 3-4% of occupations would count by today's standards as intellectually challenging. So part of it is education. Hand in hand with that is increased literacy rates, because if you can read, you're able to enhance your abstract thinking, all sorts of knowledge. You're able to learn new stuff more readily for the rest of your life. So there's the education literacy explanation. Then there's the people are healthier, there's less disease, there's less protein malnutrition throughout the world. And this certainly has something to do with how well brains function. One particular piece of that story, in 1970, the United States banned lead as an additive from gasoline. And the best estimates, good epidemiological studies suggest that in the half century since 1970, an IQ point increase is about 5 to 6 points on average could be explained by removing lead, because lead is a neurotoxin and kids' brains smelling in lead-laden car exhaust does bad things for brains. So there's that component to the story as well. Another feature is people in general are savvier about tests. There's more familiarity. You can go online and you can take your online IQ test, where then if you send them money, they'll tell you what your score is. And people are more accustomed to abstract kind of testing. And what you see is when people take an IQ test a second time, it's not the identical test, but it's been meaned out to be the same level of difficulty. When people take a second IQ test, on the average, they score about 5 points higher. So practice affects. Okay, so we've got all those things going on there. And collectively, I think that tells us like some really good news. This has been happening in every country looked at. In westernized countries, the Flynn effect has been flattening, suggesting that it's maxing out. The greatest, strongest Flynn effects right now are demonstrable in the developing world, which makes a lot of sense in terms of catching up educationally, nutritionally, in terms of health. But overall, this seems like great news. Yay, people are getting smarter. That's fantastic. And now the deflating news, which is despite that, the world is at least as much of a mess as it was 100 years ago. Smarts do not seem to be helping us a whole lot.
Next, Reinhard from Germany says, for some time now, I've had a persistent earworm, a catchy song, a haunting melody that constantly forms the background soundtrack of my inner world. Can you shed some light on the phenomenon of this persistent playing of a background song in my mind?
Earworms, completely maddening. The first mention of earworms, although it wasn't called that then, was by Edgar Allan Poe in like 1840 or so in one of his stories of something, a melody that drives you berserk. And he had a wonderful phrase for it. He called this the imp of perversity. Earworm, very picturesque term, suggestion that this is a melody, gets in your ear, worms its way in there, and gets into your brain, and you're stuck with it. When you actually go and look up earworm on something like Google Scholar or PubMed, you discover virtually all the papers are not about worms making their ways into your brain, but instead making their way into corn, ears of corn. Corn earworms as parasites and their dread hated rivals, stink bugs. They compete to devour corn ears before you can. Nonetheless, earworms in the sense that we're talking about here. What are they? It's various terms in the literature: stuck song syndrome, sticky music, involuntary music, different terms given for it. And we all know its basic characteristics. It's a fragment of music. It's a virtually random fragment of music that is suddenly stuck in your head, typically 10, 15, 20 seconds long or so. And it has some typical characteristics. It's from a popular song. You've heard it a lot. It's usually rhythmic. It's usually, and here's a word that I find bitterly redundant, catchy. Yes, of course it's catchy. You catch it. That's why it's an earworm. But every single paper on it always defines it, among other things, as being catchy. It typically has vocal parts. It's most often the chorus of a song. Now, one thing that's very interesting, suggesting sort of this latent musicianship in the majority of people, one study showed that about 70% of people, when they have an earworm torturing them and you say, "Can you sing it?" they sing it pretty much on pitch, 70% within a half step, a half tone of it being perfect pitch, that being interesting in and of itself. So, very important to note, though, that earworms are stupid and random. It could be music you love, it could be music you hate, and it's different from a music obsession. For example, I spent the 1980s being obsessed with the same Bob Marley greatest hits collection and listened to it a gazillion times, and that was not an earworm. Nor is it an auditory hallucination of music that's a whole different kettle of fish. So, what are profiles of people who get earworms? First off, it's virtually everyone. One study shows 98% of people have experienced an earworm at some point or other. And nonetheless, you see some people are more prone towards earworms than others. People with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people who are intense music lovers, which is one of life's bitter ironies, that they're the ones who are most likely to get tortured by the music that you hear when you're put on hold. The OCD connection is interesting. And this was a very thorough study giving people a whole battery of repetitive behaviors they tend to do: repetitive body focused motions, mentally repetitive behaviors, ritualistic stuff, motoric, and then seeing which of those predicted the frequency and the intensity of earworms that people reported. And what you saw was more earworms in people who have motoric repetitive behaviors, people who are tapping their feet or shaking their legs or just fidgeting with their hands all the time, or people with repetitive mental sort of processes, people who are compulsively counting, compulsively spelling words, compulsively trying to make anagrams out of the words they're looking at. These are the people who have the highest rates of earworms happening. This is something connected with repetition, the comfort of repetition, the rhythmic anchoring, solid ground of repetition. And this is a whole weird variant of it. And presumably, people have been having this for tens of thousands of years. So, earworms, most importantly, what can you do about them? One thing that is clear is it is not going to work to sit there and say, think about something else. Don't think about that memory. Don't think about a hippo. You are going to think about a hippo. Active suppression is completely useless. What are some of the things that help? Chewing gum. I don't really understand that one. Going and listening to the song that you're having the earworm of, but listen to the entire song. Especially listen to it at a different tempo than usual, played on ukuleles instead of euphoniums. Then there are what people in the business call cure songs, songs that are apparently so rote that they can blank out the earworm you got going. And they always give the same example in these studies, the happy birthday song. And it strikes me as puzzling that all this logically should do is just replace a different earworm with the one you've gotten rid of. People do puzzles, distraction, and one paper out there now using transcranial magnetic stimulation of a part of the prefrontal cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is very central to executive function, inhibiting of automatic behaviors, strengthen its excitability with TMS, this technique, and it becomes easier for somebody to suppress their earworms. So potentially that is going to be the cure for everyone. Go and get electrodes stuck to your head and drive those earworms out of your hair and send them on their way.
To wrap up, Dan from Pennsylvania says, can you falsify the claim all positions are reasoned into?
Well, all sorts of important decisions and opinions and stances and values are not reasoned into, which gives rise to one of my favorite sound bites for trying to make sense of our turmoil time, which is you can't reason somebody out of a stance they weren't reasoned into in the first place. Okay, so moral decisions. More, do we think our way to a moral decision or do we feel our way? And for most of the time since we invented the wheel, moral philosophy has been dominated by the notion that we think our way to a moral stance. And the god of that entire approach was Lawrence Kohlberg, Harvard developmental psychologist, who developed famed Kohlberg stages showing the cognitive development of kids into adolescence, into adulthood, that reifies stages of cognitive complexity. What sort of thinking goes into making your moral decisions? And this is the world of young kids. Why isn't it okay to steal the cookies? Because I might get caught. I'll get punished. To a next Kohlberg stage. Why isn't it okay to steal the cookies? Because there's laws against it. What would happen to society if people didn't pay attention to laws? It would be chaos. To the next stage, variants of the highest stage, which is why not steal the cookies? And because I couldn't live with myself, because that's an unkind thing to do, because that's not who I am, because I've got internalized moral standards. So Kohlberg developmental stages, everybody learned them, totally dominated thinking about moral philosophy. It's a cognitive process. Some problems began to pop up with Kohlberg, though. Two feel like sort of very provincial to me. The first one is big surprise, a way disproportionate share of the study subjects for the original Kohlberg studies were male, boys, teenage boys. And when you include both sexes in there, you see there's different valuings on the average. Females care more about peace. Males care more about justice, and thus different moral decisions based on that. That was the first one. And the second one is you better bet, just as we had the other week, the reliance on weird subjects. Weird subjects, a huge disproportionate share of the psychology literature coming from a tiny subset of Earth's humans, people who are westernized, educated, industrialized from rich countries, from democratic countries, and then beginning to look at cross-cultural stuff, pathways of moral development looking totally different. So those were two superficial problems with Kohlberg, which basically said, ooh, have both girls and boys and test it in a lot of different places. But there was a more fundamental problem with Kohlbergian thinking dominating moral psychology and moral philosophy, which is it's not very predictive. You can have somebody with the most highfalutin Kohlbergian stage on earth. They're going to be put in like a cage studied by moral philosophers to understand how they get there. They're so rarefied and nuanced. And are they the one who actually steps out of a crowd and does something brave and scary? Is there a relationship between one's moral stances and one's moral actions? And it turns out Kohlbergian stage predicts next to nothing as to who's going to do the scary thing when it's the right thing to do. The other thing that undermined Kohlberg was it was very context dependent. If somebody was tired, if somebody was stressed, if somebody was in a good mood, if somebody was in a room with a foul odor, you can get evidence of people being at different Kohlberg stages than when they were tested under other conditions. There was something squishy, variable about it, which is to say, emotions come into it. And which is to say that your pure abstract Mr. Spockian level of moral reasoning predicts very little about who's actually going to act on it. So this ushered in sort of the dominant model these days, which is far more than people used to appreciate. Rather than thinking our way to moral decisions, we feel our way to it. And much of this is the work of Jonathan Haidt, NYU, New York University, who's been a leader in this. In 2001, he published a very influential paper with a wonderful metaphor in its title, the notion of the emotional dog wagging its rational tail. The engine driving rational moral decision making is emotional. And he has since argued that that is way more often the case than people used to think. People used to think it's purely rational because we're humans and we make stuff and we have opposable thumbs. So, of course, we think our way. Height, since that time, has been showing how often, how intrusively emotions are the basis by which we make our moral decisions. Now, another version of that has come out of the work of neurologist Antonio Damasio, extremely influential thinker, who has what he calls the somatic marker hypothesis. And this is based on an interesting thing. Lots of episodes ago, we totally artificially broke the brain into the reptilian brain that modulates your blood pressure, your limbic system that does emotions, and your cortex that does abstract reasoning. And a key point of that whole field is amid the bias that the cortex tells the emotional brain what to do, an awful lot of the time, the emotional brain is telling the cortex what to do. And Damasio's work has shown just how important that bottom up emotional limbic influence is on moral decision making. And he has a wonderful metaphor for his somatic marker hypothesis. We're accustomed to the idea of somebody doing a thought experiment. What Damasio says is way more than people used to think. We reach our moral stances by having a feel experiment rather than a thought experiment, which is essentially your frontal cortex asking your limbic system, how would it feel if that were done to me? How would it feel if this was the outcome of my duty? How would it feel? Not thinking through like a branching tree diagram of decisions. How would it feel? And Damasio's work has shown an awful lot of the time we are working our way to decisions by our gut feelings, somatic markers, bodily markers of, does this feel okay to do? Does this feel inspiring? Does this feel repellent? That's a big part of it. Okay, so what's the evidence then that this is actually the case? First off, a term that Haidt introduced to the literature, dumbfounding. And this explains everything. Somebody reaches a moral stance. It is not okay when people do that. That's fine. That shouldn't be punished. That should be, here's a moral stance I've taken. And then you say, why? Why do you think that? And they can't come up with an explanation for you. They can't come up with a rationalization. They say, I can't quite explain it, but it is wrong, wrong, wrong when people do that. You're running purely on emotion, gut instinct, limbic, all of that. And you haven't even had time yet to confabulate a cognitive rationalization for why you have reached this gut instinct conclusion. So that's a big vote for the importance of this pathway. Another one, you do neuroimaging on people, put them in a brain scanner, and you give them scenarios where they have to posit, is this ethically okay? Is it not? And what you often see is the limbic system activates before the cortex does. The pattern of limbic activation is more predictive of the decision that you reach than the pattern of the cortical activation. And in particular circumstances, for example, you take a mock jury and somehow you squeeze the entire jury into one brain scanner, and they're deciding whether or not somebody is guilty of some crime. That's mostly cortical processing. Once they've decided the person is guilty, now they have to decide the punishment. What is the ethically appropriate punishment to hand out at that point? And that is a limbic task. So that's another piece of it. Next evidence for why so often our moral decisions are driven by emotion. The term that Haidt gives to it is social intuitionism. How much it's driven by that is how easily our moral decisions are manipulated by emotion, by viscera. Exactly the problem with Kohlbergian stages turning out not to be very consistent. Great example. You get somebody and you give them the runaway trolley problem. Lots of you know this by now. I'm pretty sure we've talked about it. A trolley is hurtling down the tracks, and inconveniently, 5 people have been super glued to the tracks, and the trolley is going to hit them and kill them all. And you have to decide, is it okay to pull a lever that's going to divert the trolley onto a side track where it's going to kill one person? Is it okay? Utilitarian challenge. Is it okay to sacrifice one person in order to save 5? And the defining feature of social intuitionism is when the task involves you pulling a lever to divert the trolley onto the side spur where it kills that person. When you pull a lever, 75% of people say it's okay to do that. When you describe it to them, you're going to have to push the person onto the tracks. Only 25% of people say it's okay to do. Wait a second, it's the exact same moral philosophy sort of quandary there. Can you sacrifice one for? And the emotional setting of it, the visceral manipulation of that is extremely important. Finally, some neuroanatomy. Okay, back a couple of minutes. Damasio's story there that you are running a field experiment. Your frontal cortex is asking your limbic system, how do you feel about that? How would you feel if this happened to you? How would you feel if it's this outcome? How would you feel? How does the frontal cortex find out what the limbic system is thinking? And limbic inputs to the frontal cortex are funneled through this area called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That's where you are sending all of your gut instincts about decision making up to the frontal cortex. So the question becomes, what happens when somebody's ventral medial prefrontal cortex is damaged, when emotion can no longer have primacy in moral decision making? And Damasio has studied a lot of these rare patients, and you've got a certain Mr. Spock school of biases. And this is going to be great because people are just going to become uber rational machines of cognitive logic, and they're not going to make stupid moral decisions based on sentimentality and weepy stuff. And this is going to be great. And what you see instead is people with ventral medial PFC damage make terrible moral decisions. For example, one thing is they have trouble having a feel that distinguishes some people from others. You ask them, is it okay to sacrifice this person to save 5? Is it okay to sacrifice your parent to do that, to sacrifice your loved one? And 99% of people out there will have different decisions if it's an immediate family member versus a stranger from the other side of the planet. And that is so instantiated that even most states in this country, you cannot force somebody to testify against a close family member. They're different. You get somebody with ventromedial PFC damage, and they don't distinguish between the two. Your loved one, a total stranger from the other side of the planet, exactly the same. I'm just deciding this utilitarian thing. Is it okay to sacrifice one to save five? You don't get a distinction there. You get horribly inappropriate social behavior. Someone with VMPFC damage will go to a dinner party and they're introduced to somebody and they'll say, "Oh, pleased to meet you. I see you are grotesquely obese." And afterward, their loved one is saying, "You can't say stuff like that." And they will say, "Why? It's true." They're not getting the gut instinct there. Finally, when people get ventromedial PFC damage, they have tremendous trouble making decisions, not just making good ones, but making decisions because they can't get a gut feeling for the outcome. So all are ways of showing how much limbic emotional social intuitionism is driving this process. Great. Okay. So we've now gotten a gigantic vote for the importance of emotion in moral decision making. So, of course, at this point, we have to be good, sensible, reasonable people and say it's a little bit of both. What are the interactions between thinking your way to a moral stance and feeling your way? And this is work that's been principally explored by two pioneers in the field. One of them is Daniel Kahneman, the late Princeton psychologist, died recently, Nobel Prize winner in economics, astounding contributions to the field, and a younger member of the field, Josh Green of Harvard. They've both explored how do you integrate feeling your way to and thinking your way to a moral stance. And they show really interesting stuff. They show there's a strong dichotomy between, forgive me, we are going to get into some thick underbrush here, philosophical deontology versus utilitarian or consequentialist thinking. Okay, before you flee, deontology. How do you decide what's appropriate? You run on rules of rights, of decisions, of duties, of things you don't have to think about because you don't do stuff like that. When people are having to make a rapid moral decision, they become deontologists. They fall back on the simple rules. This you were never, ever allowed to do. You make rapid decisions that way, and it is a pathway by which you get a lot of efficiency. You get to a quick answer, and it's one that is very dependent on cerebral rules. In contrast, when you have more time to think about a moral decision, you switch over to utilitarian thinking, consequentialism, rather than you don't do this because that's the rule. You don't do this because people don't have a right to do that. You don't do this because you have a duty to prevent that. You instead say, well, what are the consequences going to be? What are the primary? What are the secondary? What are the tertiary? And it's exactly in that realm that you are very, very dependent on gut stuff and emotional deliberations. And that's where you see that coming in. And thus, not surprisingly, what you see is, when do most of us become deontologists, just falling back on knee-jerk cognitive moral stances that we don't have to think about? When we're stressed, when we're tired, when we're afraid, when all sorts of alarms are going off in our heads that that person is a them rather than an us. That's where you fall into efficient, rapid, heuristic, shortcut making decisions about what's right or wrong, as opposed to the flexibility that goes into slowly assessing gut instincts of What would it feel like if that happened to me? What would it feel like if this was the outcome? Okay, so you just get this distinction there, this dichotomy. Kahneman framed it as fast thinking, slow thinking, and the different domains of it, but it overlaps very heavily on this style there. Rather than just descriptive, do we learn any moral lessons out of all of this? Anything prescriptive as to when it's good to think in a cognitive, rapid, deontological way, when it's good to instead be a utilitarian and work through the consequentialism and what would it feel like, which is better to be? And the answer obviously is neither is better. It's context dependent. There are some people out there who make some very strong arguments for this. For example, a bioethicist, University of Chicago, Leon Kass, has argued for the wisdom of disgust. And this is going back some weeks to disgusting bodily fluids. And Cass, who I believe was George W. Bush's head of his bioethics committee, Cass has this view that what's one of the greatest litmus tests for deciding what's right and wrong in the world out there, does it disgust you? If it's disgusting, that's a pretty good sign to you that that's morally wrong. And the way I summarize that in my head, in a salute to Johnny Cochran back when in the OJ trial, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. That Cass's basic view is if it makes you puke, you must rebuke. That's how you decide stuff. That's your moral litmus test. And no surprise, lots of people, including me, think it's terrible because the thing that disgusts you and thus is wrong, wrong, wrong is somebody else's version of love or religious belief or any such thing. It's a moving target. Disgust always is. So that's not a good prescription, which is to rule everything by disgust. Josh Green did a really interesting study some years ago that begins to show when do you want to think like a deontologist? When do you want to think like a consequentialist? And in this study, people had to decide, were they going to help out somebody in need? Two variables. Did you have to make a very rapid decision or did you have some time? The other variable was this someone who seemed like an us, who was in your in group, who looked like you, who prayed like you would, or was it an out group member? And what he showed was when you have to make a very rapid decision about an in group member who is in need, when you make the rapid decision, it's going to be generous, it's going to be pro social. When you're making a rapid decision about an out group member, your instinct is to have an antisocial response. It is only when you give people more time. When somebody is making a moral assessment about an in group member, when they have more time, that's time enough for them to begin to think, maybe I shouldn't be the one to endanger myself to save them. Someone else will do it. Or you know what? It's their own damn fault. I'm resentful of them for having done this to me. 13, you got enough time to begin to realize why maybe an automatic self-sacrifice is not what you really want to do. In contrast, when you have more time to make a moral decision about an out-group member, when you have more time rather than the first reflex, ooh, other, get them away from me. When you have more time, that lets you begin to think, oh, you know what? They had a mother also. You know what? They've got the same needs. That some version of beginning to feel your way towards a very different moral decision. So if you want to get people to be really pro-social to their close buddies, make them decide in half a second if they're going to run into the burning building. And if you want to do it instead for a total out-group member, people need a while to think about it. So that seems like very usefully prescriptive.
And that is episode 71. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.